Welcome. You have joined a webinar of the Urban Waters Learning Network after the storm, equitable recovery and resilient adaptation. This webinar is the third webinar of a series that we've done on climate and community resilience. And we are sharing two stories today from leaders who are on the ground promoting equitable recovery and resilient adaptation following storms in both New Orleans and New Jersey. We'll introduce those speakers here in a minute. So super excited to have you on board. The Urban Waters Learning Network is the sponsor to this webinar. If you're not familiar with the Learning Network, just really briefly, we are a peer-to-peer network of both people and organizations that are working on urban waterways, both to restore the waterways and to revitalize the communities that surround them. This peer-to-peer learning network is supported by the Environmental Protection Agency and is coordinated by River Network and Groundwork USA. My name is Deanna Toledo. I'm the Leadership Development Director with River Network, and happy to welcome you here. As I said earlier, today's session is the third webinar in a series that we have been hosting over the last couple of months to help members of our network and others who are not in the Learning Network understand how to promote climate and community resilience in their own communities. And so the first session, and we have recordings of these sessions, and we'll share some of those links afterwards. In our first session, we presented 3 different organizations' efforts to integrate climate change education into their programs. Our second session a couple of weeks ago, we presented some examples of efforts to center the community in resilience planning, sort of in anticipation of what might come with climate change. How do you plan for resilience in a way that really centers the community and engages the community and all of their needs in that planning process? And so today we turn our attention to what happens after the storm. How can we promote equitable recovery, sort of track what that recovery looks like, and ensure that we are rebuilding in a way that makes our communities more resilient for future possible events. So with that, I am going to turn it over to, we have 2 great presenters today, and I'm going to turn it over to Renee Mazurek, my colleague at the Urban Waters Learning Network, to introduce Arthur and Yvette. So Renee?
Thanks, Deanna. I'm happy to introduce our presenters today. Yvette Chen is the Planning and Policy Analyst at Fair Share Housing Center, where she performs data analysis, writing, and collaboration with other organizations to further fair housing and racial justice in the context of land use and disaster recovery. She first joined Fair Share Housing Center as an intern in 2014. She earned her bachelor's from Oberlin College in sociology and economics and completes her master's in city planning from the University of Pennsylvania in May of 2020. Arthur Johnson was born in the nation's capital, where he earned his degrees from the George Washington University and the University of the District of Columbia. But his roots are in New Orleans and date back to visits with his grandmother, who lived in the lower 9th Ward. He relocated to New Orleans in 1999, where he has established himself as an accomplished fundraising professional and nonprofit leader. As the Lower 9th Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development's Chief Executive Officer, he is responsible for the day-to-day operations of the organization and works closely with the staff and volunteers to advance key initiatives focused on food security and the natural and built environment. So we have these 2 experts here with us today, and I encourage you to add your questions in the chat box throughout, and we'll monitor them and make sure that our panelists can answer them whenever the presentation is done. Thanks so much.
All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with Arthur. Arthur, I'm turning over the presenter baton to you. Hopefully you can see that on your screen. And you are still probably on mute.
I'm off mute now.
There you go.
There screen went kind of crazy here. Well,
if you want, I can go ahead and launch our polls while you pull up your
yes.
presentation, Arthur.
Yeah, please do that. We're going to have several poll questions that we want to see who's in the room, and to kind of take a little teaser on what they feel are some of the issues as we look at adaptation in that point. So we'll start with the poll questions.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll. And that is really to get a sense of, so the question is, has your community experienced a natural disaster, flooding, drought, storms, sunny weather, high water, etc., in the past years? If you would just take a minute to respond to that, would love to get a sense of the experience in the room. Okay, I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. 3, 2, 1. There's a couple of votes coming in. I'm going to go ahead and close this. So, boy, 97% of you in the room, you are working or living in communities that indeed have experienced such disaster. Not great news, but I think more and more so, that's the reality for a lot of us. So let me go ahead and launch the second poll. As you think about your community's efforts to recover from that disaster, click all that apply here. How would you describe those recovery efforts in terms of how effective and how equitable they have been? And if you have other ways that you would like to describe them, I would just ask if you could tap those into the questions box. So folks, votes are coming in. I'm going to give that a chance. All right, please take. And I don't know if you're seeing, Renee, if you see, once I open it up, any of the responses on the chat box, let me know. Okay, so I'm going to give it a couple more seconds here. About 3/4 of you have voted. Please take a minute here in the last couple of seconds to do that.
And Renee, I'm having a problem. I don't see the screen.
Okay, let me read off. You may not see the poll responses, Arthur, so let me just read them off to you. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share. All participants should be able to see the results. So about an even number, 42% of you describe recovery efforts as effective. 35 of you describe them as ineffective. It's interesting on the question of how equitable that recovery has been. Only 6% of you describe it as equitable recovery, and 65% of you, 2/3 of you, say that the recovery has exacerbated existing inequities in your community. So that's interesting. So even when it's effective, that recovery has exacerbated inequities. In terms of some of the other responses, folks are saying it's hard to know how those efforts have been. There's still a learning curve in the community. And let me see, the communities in South Texas were not very prepared for, I mentioned it's for the recovery to be in place to recover from the events recent there. Okay. Let me launch a third poll and then we'll go ahead and move with the presentation. So the question here is, to what extent have local recovery efforts included community members in them and been responsive to community members' needs? To what extent have local recovery efforts been inclusive of the community and been responsive to the needs of the community? And Arthur, just be aware we're hearing a lot of background noise, I think, from your line. So about half of you are voting. Go ahead and And if you have any comments to add to this, just please use the question box to add any detail to your response. So about 3/4 of you have responded. I'm going to give it a couple more seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So only 3% of you say that to a great extent, recovery efforts have been inclusive and reflective of the community. 50 of you say to a moderate extent. 11 of you, not at all. So 11% of you say they have not at all been inclusive of the community or responsive to needs. And 36%, a significant number, it's either not applicable or don't know. So if you have any comments to add to that, please type them into the question box. Okay, so it sounds like the question of an equitable recovery is on the forefront for many of the communities represented here in the audience. And there's still some room for improvement in terms of including community members in thinking through and planning for that recovery and making sure that whatever community needs are being identified through that process are actually being reflected in what's happening on the ground for recovery. So thank you everybody for that insight. Let's go ahead and turn it to Arthur. I don't know, Arthur, are you ready to bring up your presentation? If you're not, I could bring it up.
Yeah, if you could bring it up, that'd be great, because I'm not.
Okay, if you can just give me 1 second here.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right, so let me see if I can take back control of, my apologies folks for the, let me see if I can take back control of the presentation. So, okay, so just go ahead and give me a nudge to move me past the slides.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that'd be great. I think everybody should be able to see the slide now.
Okay. All right. I'll begin.
It's all yours.
Welcome. Okay. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. You know, just looking into the poll questions, looking at some of the results, this seems to be quite on point as we talk about adaptation and particularly in the communities. And one of the key factors of we're a community-based organization, and leadership in the direction of adaptation and resilience is very important. Next slide. So as we, as an organization, the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement is a 6-year-plus organization. We were created after Hurricane Katrina, but truly started to establish ourselves over the years as we looked at the different levels and modes of what was needed, not only in the Lower Ninth Ward where we started, but we also realized that throughout the city and along the greater New Orleans area and even along the Gulf, that everyone was dealing with these challenges after Hurricane Katrina. Our focus was to strategically look at how community-driven goals will help to create and continue to thrive economically, culturally, and environmentally, specifically through the Lower Ninth Ward, and then with other communities as well. Next slide. You know, our objectives as we looked at this, and again, we continue to modify these objectives over time, even throughout today, is to look at key elements which provide a philosophy or a guide in relation of the success or what success would look like in our community. We want to determine the activities that were needed to help this community continue to thrive and move forward, and looking at the effectiveness of leadership, realizing that leadership in the community, particularly community-based leadership, is so important as we continue to move forward. And without that leadership, what you start to get are policies and other types of entities that really don't address the true problems of the community. Next slide. So we created these, what we call New Orleans principles, and these were principles that, again, were created by the community, by our leadership and our citizens, meaning community leadership, to look at what was important. And so we know, and in the discussions, realizing that we had to look at, well, first of all, respect the rights of all citizens, equity, I guess we would use in today's term, of all citizens, have the right to express their opinion and give the results on that. We wanted to also restore our natural protection. The lower Ninth Ward, a part of New Orleans, is a very unique community. It's 3/4 surrounded by water. It has the Mississippi River on one side, the Bayou Bienvenue on the other, and across is the Industrial Canal, a government controlled canal by the Corps of Engineers. So 3/4 surrounded by water. So natural protections and nature plays a great deal in the infrastructure of this community. We need to implement a planning process. Everything needs to have a process on how you're going to move forward. Without that, you kind of have chaos because there's always going to be interventions and diversions. So we needed that process in place. And we needed values in this diversity. These values were designed to protect our community, protect the city, and realizing that the community is part of the city. And so it all aspects of the city, including the Lower Ninth Ward, needed to play a role in protecting the whole, which would be the city of New Orleans, and then beyond that point, the greater New Orleans areas around it. We had to embrace smart redevelopment, and we had to honor the past as we build for the future. That very much comes into place. Particularly, you want community who understands the past, who have been there, and who understand what is necessary so that you can move forward, but in a way that you don't lose what brought you there. We need to provide passive survivability. And that basically meant we've survived the storm. Now, how do we survive after the fact? And in such a way that, again, would help it to grow and continue to move forward, because time will continue to move even if you don't. We need to foster locally owned businesses. The Lower Ninth Ward is a community that's designed with small businesses. There's no major industry, no government facilities, and also no public housing in that community. So we need to, that was understanding, again, the past and understand how we foster and continue to help small businesses continue to thrive and grow. And we need to focus on the long term. And as we've seen now, almost 15 years after Katrina, and the long term is there, and it's probably a little longer than what we imagined. Next slide. In relation to understanding this. So these principles were very important. And the next slides are pictures that we just show some of the engagement of the community during that time, which has led us to where we are. Next slide. On that point. As we next slide. Okay. We also, CSED's primary work as we were initiated was looking at 4 areas. It was food security. We were a food desert. And so having not only health and nutrition, but necessities of food accessible to the community was very important. Again, as I talked about the natural environment, the waterways, our watersheds are important for economic growth, education, recreation, and quality of life. And the built environment, that's the economic development portion, the small businesses, health clinics and things of this nature, to our schools, to help this thriving community continue to pull itself up and continue to move forward. And volunteer coordination, realizing that to be able to do a lot of this after the disaster, there were a lot of volunteers coming from all over the country and even all over the world who wanted to come help and make a difference. But there needed to be some kind of coordination, some process on how these volunteers are going to be coming in, where were they going to work on. They were going to work on residential housing, they were going to work on infrastructure. They all could be done simultaneously, but there did need to be some coordination and volunteer groups. So we had churches and we had nonprofits who were bringing people coming in, students, K-12, and university level, other companies and other groups coming in. So there needs to be some consistent coordination so that we could take full advantage of the opportunity and move forward. Next slide. Next slide. We also worked closely with government because in this disaster, it became important to make sure that government and community work together in a concerted effort to help the community move forward. Next slide. These pictures that you're seeing coming up, next slide, again, are examples of residents, how happy they feel, children and seniors and homeowners. Next slide. Looking at what was necessary as we move forward in that. These are groups of volunteers that came in and to help. We created a outdoor classroom that was used as another mechanism for growth and discussion. And it became a kind of a think tank area in that basis. Next slide. Next slide. Again, this shows how some of the volunteers came. These slides show how volunteers work not only in the community, but they also worked in our wetlands and our coastal areas to help rebuild that and refurbish those areas that had been taking a big hit from Hurricane Katrina. Next slide. Next slide. Again, our platform. This is a platform that, again, saw earlier, that overlooked Bayou Bienvenue. And as we worked with volunteers to make sure this became an integral part of the community, both for recreation as well as understanding the whole issue of environment and the need to have greater environmental input, both from state, federal, local governments to protect our community. Also, within our community, we realized there was a need to tie in residents. And so, as we talked about it being a food desert, we had a lot of opportunities to create gardens and farming types of facilities that would help not only provide fresh fruits and vegetables, but also became therapy for our community as they were dealing with these issues after the disaster. Next slide. Next slide. Again, the next pictures are showing some of the engagements that happen with young people and all different types who come down to the lower Ninth Ward. This is all part of the adaptation effort of getting people involved and of getting both residents and non-residents interacting and engaging together so that there is this very strong relationships that are built. Many of these relationships continued on and continue today as people come back, as some of the young people who now are out of school still keep in contact with the residents that they helped in their community service work. Next slide. Next slide. Again, showing more of these efforts in place. Next slide. And I think these are very important as we kind of look at our adaptations and growth in there. It brought people together that sometimes hadn't done this type of community service before, but that in their heart they felt there was a need to make that happen. And so these relationships continue. These again are pictures of, as we continue to move on, are pictures of what developed over the period of time. Next slide. But right along with that, there was also the work that had to be done. Here is myself and my chairman, Mr. William Waiters, who's a retired exec from Domino Sugar, but also chairman of our board. And also at that time, he was president of the Holy Cross Neighborhood Association. So the discussions about strategically strategies and how we continue to move forward. And these things continue today. He is still chairman of our board, and he has played a great role in our health and growth and development as we continue to move forward and be a catalyst for the lower Ninth Ward community, but also for other communities along the Gulf Coast. This shows some of the examples in our center of above bed gardens, the type of things that needed to be created because of the soil had been tainted from Hurricane Katrina. So to continue to build viable opportunities for fresh fruits and vegetables, we encourage above bed planting. And also behind the tree line is an orchard. Citrus grows very well here in New Orleans because of its tropical climate. And so oranges and lemons and limes and variations of that grow very well. Next slide. Next slide. This is a picture of our center. Shortly after we moved in, it was a house that we acquired, and we were able again to progress in recovery to move to our own center from where we started, which was in 2 rooms behind one of the most historic churches in here in the lower 9th Ward. Then we created our center diagonally across from that. And this is where we continue to develop. And so within this center, it's a working center. Action is being planned, discussions, meetings, conversations, community service work. Next slide. That's all being conducted in there. And that's so important. As we wrap up, we talk about, how do you make these things happen? So, of course, resources are very important. This is just a list of many of our funders from the very beginning up until today. We don't have as many of these anymore, but we do have still some of those relationships. So the Kresge Foundation and the McKnight Foundation out of Minnesota, the Walton Foundation has played a key role, the Greater New Orleans Foundation, as well as Tulane University and National Park Service, to say a few. These are definitely the supporters, but this is what one needs as you look at adaptation and growth, that you do have to have supporters that provide not only financial resources, but also capacity to help you continue to move forward, and that they are very integral in strategic planning and growth in that development. Next slide. This, as we wrap up, Pam DeShields. Pam DeShields was one of our founders of the Center for Sustainable Engagement Development here in the lower 9th Ward. She created this. She lived in the community. She was a native of Boston, Massachusetts, but she had the vision, and she was a community activist. And also she was president of the Holy Cross Neighborhood Association. Unfortunately, Pam left us in 2009, but her vision and her tenacity still is with us. And I still feel that there are times when I don't know which way to turn, and then something happens, and I know it must be Pam saying, look, this is what you need to do. So again, that vision is so important as continuing to move forward in the growth and development in the direction of where you need to go. Next slide.
I think that might be the end of the slides.
Okay, that's the end of the slides.
Yep.
Well, great.
Mm-hmm.
So this kind of gives you a feel for what we've done in the lower 9, both past, current, and present, and where direction we're going into the future. And again, these are so important that I cannot overemphasize the importance of community-based leadership, getting those who are most impacted and infected into the decision-making process. That's how you build resilience. That's how ownership is there. And it's a struggle, because many times governments and private industry, particularly large industry, doesn't see as much the importance of the community as they feel they want to help the community. But the best way of helping is getting the community involved and working together in a collaborative and coalition that brings all elements together of public and private and nonprofit and community, all together, working together in one direction that, again, is going to help and impact those who are most affected. And that helps in recovery, but it also will help in preparing for potentially future disasters that come up. So again, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Arthur. And before we turn it to Yvette, maybe one question here. I don't know if you might have any words of wisdom to share, looking at something like post-Katrina recovery from your perspective as a nonprofit, which I imagine is hamstrung in capacity and funding support. Most nonprofits are. What was that process of making sure that your efforts and any initiatives that you're leading on were coordinated with that of other groups, local groups, or some of the national groups that came into New Orleans, and all of the federal agencies, all of those resources that suddenly landed upon New Orleans? How were you able to manage coordinating your work with those other entities, given that there's limited capacity and immediate needs for your staff and volunteers?
Well, it's I can't overemphasize the importance of collaboration of organizations in the community and those who are trying to help the community on the outside. It is very, very important. In the very beginning, after Katrina, there wasn't as much collaboration, but that started to gel because the community demanded that there be collaboration. They demanded that they would be at the table and not just on the table as decisions were being made. And so that took a little bit of time for both public entities, particularly local and state governments, to understand how important that was, and that the community wasn't going to be force-fed, but that they definitely wanted to be part of the feeding process for growth of that community. And they wanted to be part of that decision making, but it is enormously important because in too many times decisions are being made outside of those who are most impacted. My understanding is like Hurricane Sandy it went up the East Coast a couple of years ago as a hurricane and started to impact from the Carolinas all the way, up to the Boston area. That still there's a lot of need being done that we don't always hear about in the media. You hear about when it happens, but after that, then you're kind of lost. You really have to dig deep. But it's the community that plays a role. And so we've gone and we've had members of our team go in those areas to help and direct and help guide. And that's another part of the collaboration. It's not only in your local community areas, but it's in your region. It's in the cities. Those who can help, nonprofits helping other nonprofits and understanding what are some of the challenges that they face in the community, of bringing these communities back. Because your community base is just that. It's in the community, it's well known, and it's there to help. And they know what are some of the ups and downs that can happen in trying to bring this about. They faced it firsthand.
Great. And thank you for that response. I have one more question that I'll pose, if you might briefly respond to it as I turn over the presentation status to Yvette to tell us more about Hurricane Sandy. So the question comes from Ginger. Some barriers to set up local programs come down to regulatory restrictions that have to be overcome. Do you have any examples of how those challenges can be overcome to make some of this work a reality in the community?
Well, I think that policy change, again, is a very viable entity that must happen. And we're finding more so in today, in 2018, 2019, that those terms of policy, how to change policy from the community effort, is getting more traction than it did. There it became a tug of war. It became literally battles and sometimes fighting. So I will say that, putting the right people in public office, that process is important, because having the right policy leaders understanding what the issues are. But that means going to the polls. That means making sure that you understand what the issues are and spreading that knowledge within your community. So I will say that it is very important about policy change, and to make policy change, we did that. We started realizing that we needed to gather and work with our voter coalitions as another collaborative of bringing people to the polls and getting them to be knowledgeable about who they vote for. Not telling them who to vote for, but just giving them the information and letting them make the best choices possible.
Great. Thank you for that. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Arthur. There's a couple more questions that I'll get in your way, and people asking to reach you directly. So I'll send those to you afterwards. So With that, Yvette, let's turn it over to you. If you might want to go ahead and start the slideshow right now, we can see all your slides along the left-hand side as well. But please, turning it over to you. Looking forward to hearing about recovery from Sandy.
Great, I think it's working now, right?
Yes, yes, it's great.
Oh, I see it. All right, hey everybody, I'm Yvette Chen. I'm the Policy and Planning Analyst at Fair Share Housing Center, and we're a group based in New Jersey. So today I'll be talking about using data for equitable disaster recovery. As Arthur said, the government and the community need to work together in a concerted effort. And so hopefully by explaining some of our strategies and our experience with Hurricane Sandy, you'll get some of a better framework for understanding disaster recovery and how to advocate for most impacted communities. So here's just a slide about past disasters. Because of climate change, we have to adapt to new circumstances, and we've learned some lessons from the past to help us better link recovery to communities and their long-term goals. So on the very left, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina really illustrated the importance of having an immediate response. Superstorm Sandy in 2012 taught us certain lessons about rebuilding and building back smarter and with more resiliency in mind. And then lastly, Hurricane Harvey on the right, along with Irma and Maria in 2017, have showed us that disaster planning can't wait until after a disaster strikes. So that's just some framing. Obviously, there have been many other disasters since then and in between. So I want to start off by framing federal disaster aid. So here are the two main agencies responsible after a federal disaster. FEMA is the emergency management team, and they provide the most rapid relief through individual assistance and temporary shelter assistance. And HUD, the second one, is a source of funding for long-term recovery and mitigation. Typically, they spend money through the CDBG-DR, Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery. And to allocate these funds, they first do an assessment of unmet needs. And I will be discussing both the IA, the Individual Assistance Program, and the CDBG-DR unmet needs assessments later in this presentation. Okay. So another framing slide, inequality in disaster management and planning. The federal government spends billions of dollars annually helping communities rebuild and prevent future damage. And so this picture here from Mansville, New Jersey is just an example of a property buyout. So you can see by the number on the building that the home is part of a federal disaster buyout program run by FEMA. There was an NPR study that came out last spring, and it looked at 40,000 property buyouts nationally and found that white Americans and those with more wealth are often receiving more federal dollars after a disaster, and Black residents lose wealth typically. Also important to note is that homeowners are most likely to benefit. So this split between renters and homeowners is something that became really crucial in our advocacy after Superstorm Sandy. So Superstorm Sandy hit in 2012, and it also showed how recovery decisions exacerbate inequality. Primarily, there was a disparate treatment of homeowners and renters. So the needs assessment done for the CDBG-DR funding through HUD really underestimated the needs of renters and low-income people. And we found this through an analysis of more granular data that we received through Open FEMA, which I'll discuss further in the presentation. And essentially, the state of New Jersey was undercounting the needs of renters by half. It assumed that only 22% of the damaged units were renter units, when in actuality, it was 43%. Importantly to note, nearly half of the renters impacted were Black and Latinx, compared to 16% of homeowners. So in 2013, Fair Share Housing Center, along with the NAACP and the Latino Action Network, filed a complaint alleging race-based discrimination against renters. And this led to the reallocation of $500 million in federal recovery funds, which was the largest settlement ever reached under federal fair housing history. So under this settlement, Sandy funding was required to target the hardest hit communities, addressing the language barriers in recovery programs, because a lot of people that could only, a lot of Spanish speakers couldn't understand the materials that were only distributed in English. So one of the main goals was to address language barriers in recovery and also assist both renters and homeowners, because as we found, the recovery program as it stood was mainly helping homeowners. Because of our efforts, over 7,000 low-income families that otherwise would not have had the opportunity to rebuild ended up moving to less flood-susceptible areas or receiving funds for in-place elevation and mitigation. In 2016, there was a joint agency guidance put out and issued by the U.S. Department of Justice, FEMA, and the Department of Homeland Security, HUD, the Department of Transportation, and HHS. So this was released in August 2016, and this guidance recognizes the importance of communities of color to access critical recovery programs and activities. And we're building on our work by responding to current disasters by working with groups on the ground to share best practices and analyzing and using data. So this brings me to the Open FEMA individual assistance data. So for our advocacy efforts after Hurricane Sandy, we used a simplified version of this data set. And this data on IA applicants is information that is released fairly quickly after disaster declaration. And currently in this data set, which you can access through the link there, in the first bullet point, there is more than 4 million entries, and they have data on IA applicants with assessments conducted by FEMA inspectors. So currently the data in that, it's almost 5 billion. And that 5 billion entries is from Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, both in Puerto Rico and Florida, Maria, and Florence. So we got Open FEMA to release this data for the first time in early 2018 after a year-long process of working with them to develop the information and ensure that nobody's privacy would be compromised. And in prior disasters, this information wasn't available to the public, which made assessing damage and proposing solutions on equity and resilience really, really hard, especially at the community level. And this data is really great because it's it's not a complete data set and there's still a lot of things to be worked out, but there are variables on geography to a very small scale. So the smallest scale that they have included is a census block ID, which allows you to look at variations in just a neighborhood. It also has variables on demographics like income, tenure, household composition, disaster impacts like the level of water damage, and also the eligibility of assistance for different programs for renters, for homeowners, for small businesses, things like that. In the data set, you can see all the variables online if you hit the link, but the data set has 40 different variables. So how has Fair Share and how have the people we worked with supplemented and used this data set? Most important, I think, is to make sure to integrate it with census or ACS demographics. So the Open FEMA data set doesn't actually have data on race. It does have data on income, but we usually link it up through zip code or census block to identify racial trends. It also has allowed people to understand flooding and floodplain mapping a little better. So every property assessed has detailed information on the flood extent, and this can help shape plans for resilience and rebuilding. And lastly, the individual assistance data set is really helpful in analyzing and integrating unique dynamics into our responses. So one example of this is, if there's a disproportionate number of flooded properties with elderly populations, that might lead to focus a little bit more on mobility and ensuring that seniors have access to everything like their medicine or to energy and power. On the right is a map of Florida because this data was also used by the state of Florida in their methodology to identify the counties most in need for funding for low-income rebuilding, and it led to immediately allocating $5 million in initial grants. And this data has also been used by Texas Housers, which is a housing organization that we work with, and they showed that FEMA assistance is correlated by income. And it's also been used in Puerto Rico by the head of the Urban Planning Society. They showed that the proposed resiliency and infrastructure projects by the Puerto Rican government missed a lot of the low-income communities where damage was the greatest. This is my final slide, just a little bit broader about how we can reform and think about disaster recovery going forward. So there was a study done that found that for every $1 spent on mitigation, it saves $6 in federal resources. And so this is really powerfully showing that we need to ensure that all communities benefit from mitigation infrastructure to protect against future disasters, which we know are worsening and intensifying with climate change. In disaster recovery efforts, I think that we are trying to advocate for greater coordination among federal agencies. So these agencies include FEMA and HUD, as I showed in that framework slide, but also programs across departments like the Interior, Agriculture, and Defense Infrastructure, Interior, Agriculture, and Defense departments. And lastly, we would like to improve infrastructure and building design standards so that they account for climate trends. Disasters are also worsening due to accelerated construction in floodplains, and so I think these trends need to be factored in. And that is the end of my presentation.
All right, thank you, Yvette. A question. The joint guidance that you made a reference to, is that something that is applies to agency or sets guidance for how agencies coordinate for any disaster, or was that specific to the Sandy recovery?
It's hard to, I don't think that the agency guidance has been enforced very well. Obviously, if you look at places like Puerto Rico and their recovery, but it applies to all disasters. If you see, it's really small, but it says it applies to recipients engaged in emergency preparedness, response, mitigation, and recovery activities. So this is just an ongoing guidance, but it hasn't been enforced very well by the departments that released it.
Mm-hmm. Great. And can you say anything about using the FEMA data set? Is this pretty much in real time as funds are being dispersed that this database gets updated, or was this like after the initial flush of funding hit the ground that you were able to do that sort of equity analysis on those expenditures?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I was actually I actually wasn't here for the first round when we used that data, but I think it was released pretty quickly. Like, I think maybe the funding came out first and then we were able to get the data to analyze it, but I'm not completely sure of that.
Okay. Another question came in here from Sabrina. Can you tell us, have local recovery efforts throughout New Jersey included community members?
Yeah, so that was another part of our advocacy efforts. So we did a lot of work with the Housing and Community Development Network in New Jersey, and like the New Jersey Organizing Project to meet with the Secretary of HUD and release reports about what was happening to people affected by the storm, especially renters. And there was also a push working with like the media and editorial boards to make sure that the public knew who was being omitted. So our efforts definitely weren't like just through law and policy. There was a lot of community organizing, but usually we partner with other groups that have a lot of connections already.
Okay, great. And I think another question has come in from Julie, and I think this would be for both Arthur and Yvette. Let me see if I can see this. What is the gap between how people in need communicate versus how FEMA distributes funds? How do you bridge that gap before a disaster? Is it possible to prepare ahead of time to effectively work with FEMA? I don't know if either of you might have experience to share about how to help communities position themselves to set up good collaboratives with FEMA as an agency.
Sure, I'll try that. Well, yes, you can work with the public agencies like FEMA, but it is very difficult. What we found is that the community, of course, has a certain sense of urgency. They're trying to get back into their homes. They're trying to get their neighborhoods back and running. They're trying to get those economic development capacities, stores, schools, things of that nature in place so that they can hopefully help to get back to some normal quality of life. Of course, the government has its bureaucracy. And so, this whole idea that if it's destroyed, we will replace it as it once was. Well, unfortunately, time does move on, and particularly in older neighborhoods, replacing something the way it was usually doesn't meet code, and local and even state laws have changed and permits. So then there gets into this delay because it then has to get out of the hands of the community and in the hands of the local government and FEMA to try to work out a compromise. In the meantime, those most impacted are, sitting there twiddling their thumbs and getting very anxious because every day is impacting their life, and that's where the big problem goes in. So yes, I think there is ways to do that. However, it's no one size fits all disaster, and it kind of a lot depends on a lot of variables of who's responsible in the public agency and how patient and creative the community is in trying to find a happy medium and the type of response that will hopefully address both issues on both sides.
Mm-hmm. Great. We have, I don't know, Yvette, if you have anything to add to that. And another question has come in. We have a number of federal agencies folks, representatives here in the room. And Kelly asked, do either of the presenters have recommendations for how federal agencies like FEMA and HUD can better partner with communities in times of non-disaster to build their resilience?
I'll go again. I think that it would be excellent for agencies like FEMA and other agencies that deal with disasters to, when times of not disaster and urgency, to find ways to communicate and kind of do prep work in when there is a disaster that comes up. It would also mean that there's not as much anxiety being placed in the room when there's not this elephant in the room that's sitting out there and you needed a remedy. I think that would be excellent to help, and maybe public federal agencies working within their local offices to bring together communities that they, that have been hit with disasters and having some engagement. I think that would help to ease much of the anxiety when the disaster does hit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that.
And I will add to that that one way of helping for public agencies to make that happen is probably going and connecting with nonprofit entities as comparable to local government, who will probably say they have so many things to deal with, but the nonprofits and the community-based organizations are there and do understand the need to have this kind of prep work before a disaster could possibly hit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had an answer to that. Sorry, I was muted before. So my answer to the last question would be, before a disaster hits, I think that like green infrastructure and generally like mitigation projects are going to become more popular. And so trying to look at the data and see where flooding has been in the past and where projects are actually going, that's something that you can map and to better understand like dynamics by race and class in those processes and to question what's happening. And then I completely agree with Arthur on this second question of the importance of partnering with local organizations and people that have been engaged in the community and with residents for a long time.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay, well, this brings us to the top of the hour. So I just want to start to wrap things up and thank both of our presenters today, Arthur and Yvette. Thank you so much, not just for sharing the experience of recovery in New Orleans and across the New Jersey coast, but just the work that you're doing on the ground. Super appreciative for you sharing that with our audience today. I do, before you go, you will be receiving an email immediately in the next couple of hours with a link to an evaluation survey. Please, if you would take 1 minute, we promise it doesn't take more than that, to give us some feedback. It helps us improve our offerings and provide some back information to the folks that support these sort of training initiatives. Again, you see down below, there's a series of webinars that preceded today's session. So in that email that you'll receive, we'll link to those recordings and some of the resources that we've been compiling at urbanwaterslearningnetwork.org website. So take a look at those. If you are not already a member of the Learning Network, we encourage you to reach out if you're interested. It includes a number of federal agency representatives as well as a lot of NGOs. And what we're hoping to do following this series of webinars is to explore interest in creating some sort of working group to both learn from one another and share experiences and bring additional training and resources around building community resilience and climate resilience. So the way you would hear about that opportunity if you want to engage in other conversations around this would be by joining the Urban Waters Learning Network. And there's my name, Diana Toledo with River Network, and my counterpart at Groundwork USA, Maria Brodin. You can reach out to us for information on that learning network. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and close off today's session. Again, thank you all for your participation and taking time today to join us. Thank you to our speakers, Arthur and Yvette, and thank you to my counterpart, Renee, who is the Wonder Woman behind the scenes pulling it all together. So with that, have a great afternoon, everybody, and keep an eye out for the recording. That will also be linked to the email that you receive. So please feel free to share that around. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.